The Canadian automotive industry has a fascinating history. These days, the Canadian car industry is closely linked to the American car industry. But if we go back in time, we find some big differences. Each of the big three had a different strategy for dealing with Canada's car market. For several reasons, they made some unique models for the Great White North. Car manufacturers in Canada had to use as many local components as possible, because after the Second World War, the Canadian government put high tariffs on imported vehicles and parts. To save costs, the US-based car makers used mixed parts for their Canadian models. For example, Canada's Dodge lineup basically used a Dodge front end grafted onto a Plymouth body, leading to the nickname Plodge. I have a separate video about those if you're interested. For the same reason, Canada's Pontiac models were very closely related to Chevrolets. The Pontiacs in question included the Pathfinder, Stratochief, Parisian and Laurentian. Unlike the Plodge cars, the Pontiacs weren't simply rebadged Chevrolets, or even Chevrolet bodies with Pontiac front ends. The body and interior were mostly Pontiac, so to the untrained eye, they looked just like American Pontiacs. However, underneath, they were all Chevy. The engine, chassis and running gear came from the Bel Air. Pontiac in Canada didn't use Pontiac engines or the wide-track frame that Pontiac developed in the States. As a result, the bodies are ever so slightly different. You can't swap bodies between the American and Canadian Pontiacs. I wonder what you would call these cars. Chevriac? Pontrolet? This lineup started soon after the war ended. The first model was the Fleet Leader, which used the shorter wheelbase that Chevy used, as well as various Chevrolet body parts depending on the year. For 1953, the model name was changed to Pathfinder and Laurentian. The Pathfinder also had a deluxe model that was renamed Stratochief in 1958. From 1959, the Stratochief replaced the whole Pathfinder series, and Pontiac introduced a new top-of-the-line model called Parisian, joined by the Grand Parisian in 1965. The Canadian lineup followed the same year-to-year updates as the US market Pontiacs, such as the Catalina and Bonneville, just with different names and Chevy engines. By the 1970s, the Canadian Pontiacs had the same body and frame as the American versions, although they still had Chevrolet engines. Also, the lineup changed. From 1971, the Stratochief was discontinued, the Parisian got the Brougham suffix, and Pontiac in Canada started using the Catalina, Bonneville and Granville nameplates from down south. The lineup changed regularly during the mid to late 70s. In 1975, the Granville became a Brougham, and the next year it was replaced by the Bonneville Brougham. When the full-size platform got downsized in 77, the Canadian lineup was condensed into three models: Parisian, Laurentian and Catalina. But the Brougham made a brief return later. Things changed a lot in 1982. The Catalina and Laurentian were dropped, leaving the Parisian as the only full-size model. Also, Pontiac decided to downsize the Bonneville from full-size to mid-size. The Canadian version was originally called the Grand Le Mans, but it got the Bonneville name in '84. Pontiac soon realised that they'd downsized the Bonneville a bit too much, since it meant that the US market had no full-size Pontiacs anymore. So, starting in 1983, they imported the full-size Parisian from Canada and sold it in the States. In 1987, the Bonneville returned to a full-size platform shared with the Oldsmobile 88 and Buick LeSabre. In Canada, the Bonneville now replaced the Parisian, bringing an end to the long-running Chevrolet-based lineup. Much like Chrysler's Plodge cars, the Pontiac Parisian and Laurentian were also sold overseas. They were assembled from completely knockdown kits in Australia by Holden, and from semi-knockdown kits in New Zealand by GMNZ. Right-hand drive models shared dashboards with the Chevrolet Impala. But in 1968, GM pulled Chevrolet and Pontiac out of right-hand drive markets, although the local plants kept assembling their leftover kits for one more year. Canada's Pontiac story isn't quite over yet. In the late 40s, the Big Three split their Canadian dealer networks into two parallel branches. GM's networks were Chevrolet Oldsmobile and Pontiac Buick GMC. Either network could also offer Cadillac depending on where you lived. Because of that split system, Pontiac always had to offer cheaper vehicles in the same class as Chevrolet. They were usually rebadged Chevys, but they had slight cosmetic differences and were sometimes a little nicer, part of the reason why Pontiac was Canada's favourite GM brand. When Chevrolet released a Chevette in 1976, Pontiac sold it as the Acadian, bringing back a name they'd previously used for a sub-brand. Americans got a Pontiac version in 1981, called the T1000, which was also offered in Canada alongside the Acadian. In 1987, Chevrolet released the Corsica, and of course, Pontiac again offered their own version, the Tempest, bringing back another old name. The Americans never got this one. The Tempest had different taillights from the Corsica, although the Chevy adopted the Pontiac's light cluster in 1991. The L-body Tempest was replaced by the new N-body Grand Am for 1992. When General Motors collaborated with Isuzu, the Canadian market got the Pontiac Sunburst as the counterpart to the Chevy Spectrum. Also, when GM teamed up with Suzuki, Canada got the Pontiac Firefly to match the Chevy Sprint and Geo Metro, and later they got the Pontiac Sunrunner to match the Geo Tracker, although that's a bit of a long story which I covered in my earlier GM video. Finally, Canada got the Pontiac Wave to match the Chevy Aveo. Eventually, the Americans got this one too, as the Pontiac G3. The G3 Wave would be the last new Pontiac model, since, as we know, GM shut the brand down in 2010. Despite its success in Canada, its unique identity, and its potential in the emerging performance market, Pontiac got overlooked in favour of Chevy clone brand GMC. Even though interested parties offered to buy Pontiac and keep it going, GM voted to ditch the brand instead, which made a lot of people quite upset. In fact, I remember being disappointed about it at the time, despite being on the other side of the world. Anyway, down to this day, General Motors of Canada still has remnants of its split dealer system. Chevrolet dealers and Buick GMC dealers are usually separate, although some dealers combine both. Not sure if that makes sense for the truck lineup though. Cadillac can also be sold through either franchise, just like in the old days. Speaking of Cadillac, their current sedans are clearly aimed at BMW, with their powerful engines, manual transmission options, precise handling and firm seats. They're the complete opposite of what a Cadillac was meant to be, but they're exactly the kind of cars that Pontiac would have been making now, which makes me quite sad. The V-Series and Blackwing cars should really be wearing the Pontiac arrow, not the Cadillac crest. So, in essence, GM still makes Pontiacs, just not with the right badge. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in another video.